All right. Good afternoon, everybody. And once again, welcome to the 121 Mining. My name, as Amy just nicely introduced, is Tolu Disu, and I am a director at CrossBoundary Energy. So I'll start with my introduction, and then I will introduce our speakers today. So, critical minerals and metals are essential for the energy transition because they are key components in the technologies needed to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and support renewable energy systems and promote a more sustainable and resilient energy future. The World Bank estimates that about 3 billion tons of minerals and metals will be needed to deploy enough wind, solar, geothermal power, and energy storage to achieve a future of 2 degrees Celsius. This is more than about 1,000 times the annual run from South Africa's largest copper mine in Arbor, and about 50,000 times the copper produced from that mine every year. In Africa in particular, there plays a pivotal role in the global transition due to the vast reserves of critical minerals, which is looking at about 55.1% of cobalt, which is essential for renewable energy technologies. However, we struggle with a diverse set of challenges which happens to slow down the economic progress for the continent. Africa's mining sector finds itself in an interesting position. On one hand, the sector and the continent in general stand to benefit enormously from the future demand, and mining is the catalyst for the low carbon future. On the other hand, if these metals and minerals are not mined sustainably, a low carbon transition will be fruitless. Additionally, the increased pressure of investors to provide more responsible and transparent supply chain means that we need to maximize the positive impact across social and environmental ecosystems. The mining sector then has a lot to do with regards to decarbonizing and helping the future with decarbonization. And it looks like this is like a double bind. So we have a lot of opportunities here and a lot of lessons that need to be learned. For example, using renewable energy sources in mining can provide a blueprint for other carbon and energy intensive sectors. In turn, if we popularize this, we can increase the demand in critical minerals, metals, and bolster the revenues for the mining operations. Now, the question we are here to answer today is, how can Africa seize the opportunity and lead in social impact, reduce environmental degradation, and ensure their shared value? I would like to go into the first question, which is from Mwelwa, which is, why should investors and miners look to Africa to supply battery metals? Or perhaps from another angle, why should African battery metal producers like yourself focus on to ensure we have the inside track to deliver this enormous market? Is there an advantage?
Thank you, Tolu. I think as the world transitions to a clean power future, Africa is at the epicenter. If we're talking about proximity to key markets, if we're talking about resource opportunities. In fact, in the conversation, I'd actually like to say that Africa is not an alternative, but a necessity in the battery metal supply chain. So why I think investors and miners should be looking to Africa, if you're talking from a resource abundance and potential perspective. Cobalt, there is 70% of the world production is out of the DRC. If you look at lithium, you now have some large producers out of places like Zimbabwe and Namibia. Actually, our company, Prospect Resources, explored and pushed up the curve, one of the largest producers out of Zimbabwe at the moment in the Arcadia lithium. Nickel and graphite, as we know, South Africa, Mozambique, Botswana are active in the space. And of course, new finds, the copper belt, Zambia is very open and there's a lot of new exploration projects out of there. If you look at a competitive cost structure as a second point, it's well known that Africa has lower operating costs, cost efficiency. Again, a mention of DRC with the rich surface deposits, so there's less intensive drilling costs, as an example. Infrastructure investments, the Lobito corridor, which has been a massive undertaking, will connect DRC Zambia to the Angolan ports. If we look at, as I mentioned earlier, the proximity to key markets, in my view, Africa is in a strategic position in terms of the global supply chain. China and Africa's synergies. China is a massive producer in the battery mineral space, and they have invested a lot in the extractive industry in Africa. So there's that ongoing relationship. On the flip side, you also have the EU diversification strategy, the US Inflation Reduction Act, and I think both strategies, if you dive deep into it, really speaks towards a non-Chinese supply chain. So I feel Africa can bridge that gap, or get into strong trade agreements off the back of that. And I think maybe as a fourth point, the ethical sourcing. So Zambia would probably be an unfair example, but I'll use Zambia. Oh, by the way, I'm Zambian, so you can tell that I'm a little bit biased there. But 90% of the baseload power in Zambia is hydro. So if you talk about clean energy powered mines, Zambia is a very good example of that by default. There's obviously challenges around artisanal mining. I think we are getting better in Africa. There's been a deliberate integration into the formal supply chain of artisanal miners. And then beneficiation and refinery. So I think the value add and the move away from exporting raw material is prevalent in Africa. Maybe just the second part of your question, Tolu, where you asked, is there a competitive advantage? Yes, there is. And for me, key to that is fast-tracking exploration and project development. So transparency around mine permitting, regulatory approvals, and speeding up that process. And within that, allowing expertise and time to explore and develop those projects. From a financing perspective, I think it's key that financiers take their time and have a long-term view to funding across all of these sectors. Exploration does take time. Development takes a lot of time and requires quite a bit of capital. And I think there's a lot of cute ways of financing this as well. From a government perspective, investment as well. Investment into mapping. So Zambia, again, has spent a substantial amount of money on geographic mapping. And I also think that there's potential and scope for governments to invest in JVs. But even within that, whether it's through government or through project development, there should also be some investment or leverage on modern technology. So Cobalt is a very good example, as they're currently using artificial intelligence to be more efficient in their exploration and development. And so a lot of these new ideas and technologies are coming into the space in Africa. And then maybe just as a last point, moving away and beyond extraction. So refining and value add, as I mentioned earlier, investment in infrastructure, mostly around logistics. It's a key challenge in Africa, but a massive opportunity. Regional alliances, so you've seen the Zambia DRC agreement. And then finally, critical mineral strategy, so a roadmap that can stand the test of time.
Thank you. I guess, Billy, what can the shift from fossil fuels do for African economies, and what are the key challenges that need to be overcome?
Thanks, Tolu. Good afternoon, everyone. I think, as Mwelwa has pointed out, we as a continent have got an opportunity to really benefit from the current energy transition that's happening. I think that's the point we need to first of all understand. However, like any transition, there are risks and opportunities. So the way I think about it is, on the opportunity side, we do have a opportunity to change and have the energy transition be a game changer for the continent. How does the continent then really transform from where we currently are to a different level where we're really benefiting from these minerals that we do know that Africa is endowed of? So I think from a continent perspective, there lies a great opportunity, and some of the points that have been raised around how we collaborate, how we work together, I think that creates a very good opportunity for us to move forward. However, we do know that also that the continent is being built and has been built on some elements of fossil fuels in the continent. I mean, you look at the South Africa economy, we still use a lot of coal. How do we make sure that that transition is just and we don't leave anybody behind, right? So there is a conversation that must be clearly had about a clear, just transition. But over and above that, I think there is an opportunity for communities to benefit in terms of what the minerals can do for those communities. How do we make sure that we avoid the resource curse and we move to a resource opportunity for the continent? And I think there are many examples where there have been resources, and once the resources have been mined, some of those communities are suffering. How do we make sure that with this energy transition, we don't get there? So for me, how we overcome those challenges is engagement, making sure that we bring everybody along. We overcome the challenges of them and us, because generally the people that will be investing would come from somewhere else. And we've seen it in some of the jurisdictions where I remember growing up in diamonds and, working in diamonds, and you'd never seen a diamond in your life. But you go to Antwerp, you see people carrying them in your pockets, right? And then it's a different perspective to say, I come from where these minerals come from, but the prosperity is different. So how do we overcome those challenges? And we need to set it up from ourselves in terms of governments, in terms of industry, in terms of investors, to make sure that everybody benefits in this transition. And we can talk about ways about how one leverages those opportunities along the value chains, because again, there are examples where there has been success. I mean, Johannesburg itself is built on the mining industry. It was not a Johannesburg until gold was discovered, and now we've got a city like that. And there are other cities around the continent that are developing like that. And I think for me, that's where the opportunity lies, and the key challenge is to avoid falling into the pitfalls where things have not gone right. Thanks.
Thank you. Erez?
Yes.
How can we achieve a just transition? What is needed from companies and investors operating across the continent? And how do we ensure the world's race for critical minerals doesn't destroy mine and our beautiful home?
Well, we can talk about that for hours, but I'll try to make a few points and observations. I think that one of the advantages that I suppose Africa has is that in many ways you don't need to correct things, but to start fresh. So it's a little bit like telecom when 25 years ago or so cell phones came to Africa. They did not have to replace or displace landlines in many places. That was the first time. So you could actually implement something fresh. So there's, from that perspective, there's a bit of a half full glass, I suppose, in the fact that you are filling a void and not necessarily correcting things that are broken. A lot has to do, I think, with not so much what you do, but how you do, and just as on an anecdotal level, there's a graphite company in Quebec called Nouveau Monde Graphite, and they will be part of the Bécancour industrial zone where battery materials will be made, but the mine itself is a pretty simple, surface graphite mine. But what they did there when they were optimizing their mining plan, they went and consulted with the communities around them, and that area is sort of a recreation area where you have those, snowmobiles in the winter and a lot of biking and hiking when the weather is nicer. And what they did was the way they planned the roads in the mine itself, the access and sort of how things are done, is already thinking about the next use of the land once they rehabilitate and give it back. So it's not just about stacking safe, dry tailings to make sure that there's no Brazilian-style drama on CNN, but they already consulted and said, wait a minute, for us, all things being equal, if the road is another, 1 kilometer longer or not, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a big deal. The slope, as long as it's safe, could be a little bit different. So the mine plan and the mine design is already thinking about the next use of the land. So that type of thinking out of the box, I think, is one of the ways for equitable distribution of the benefits of the extractive industries. Another thing is, which is important, I think, is to embrace innovation, all the way from exploration to rehabilitation. And there are, like you mentioned, cobalt that's exploring in Zambia. There's other companies. There's a company called Verai that Orion, which is somewhere here, invested in. There's a lot of innovation going on into exploration tech. There's quite a few companies that are either processing the information faster with the benefit of machine learning and AI, but also collecting and analyzing more data sets than were previously considered relevant. But the result of doing that, if you can actually explore much faster, and most important, let go a lot of the non-relevant areas and shrink your prospecting to exploration to eventually exploitation area faster, then there's less disturbance to communities. There's less, feeling of being intruded. And the timelines, which once they're shrunk, it also enables investors with a shorter horizon to start potentially looking at exploration and discoveries. And that's the lifeline of everything we're doing. You just need to keep pushing them into the sausage factory. Otherwise, there's going to be nothing out there in 2035. So that's an example of how technology can help. Another, we're seeing that all over. And I think because you're starting fresh in many ways, you can actually be the place where, and Africa can be the place where a lot of innovative technologies and ways of doing things better, cleaner, in a more integrated way can be happening. Another example is there are a few companies that are working on spending less energy on mining, crushing, and comminution. Just from a mountain to whatever you need to either smelt or leach and start your process. How can you spend less energy? So there's a company in France from the Friedland's stable, and New Lab, which is a generator of, it's a cluster, it's a high-tech cluster in the US, has a company called, that came from there called Eden Geopower, that oversimplistically zaps the rock with a specific current, which makes it more brittle and fragile, and then it consumes less energy as you go through the stages. But it turns out that it also helps in taking the rock from alpha to beta, where it's amenable for leaching, because the way it's fractured is along the conductive mineralized lines. So this means that suddenly some ISR projects become more economical because you need less time and less acid to pump up the leach solution. It's true about so suddenly it turns out that something that was designed to crush the rocks using less energy, which is a great thing. You're using 50-60% less energy, is also very important in preparing the ore for the next stage. And as we know, sorting and the various technologies that bring tailings and low grades into the money and enable us to tackle them is very important. So we can go through, from exploration all the way to final rehabilitation. There are many segments of inefficiencies where if you solve for something and you just keep crunching and improving, then you create a much more profitable, friendly, and also environmentally friendly type of extractive, industry and mineral industry. And what we're also seeing, and I think that's going to be very important here as well, with growing middle class, young population, bringing people up into the system, is that the need to create not just, if historically we were talking about every project was a separate node. And then we became mostly vertically integrated, and we started, horizontally integrated is where the regulator interferes. But now we're seeing those 3D projects where you're making your power. If you're choosing you're using sulfuric acid, you may want to have your own your own acid plant and generate the power that's required for the mine. You're mining for something, but if it turns out that the area around it is actually porous, and if you pour fizzy water on it, it actually stays forever until the sun becomes a supernova, then suddenly you have a geological carbon sequestration project as part of your project. And now maybe when you're selling a ton of nickel, you're also selling 6 tons of carbon credit, real carbon credit, not avoidance, true sequestration. And I think that Africa is perfect for that, because you can really go all the way from the energy, from the desalination, through the hydrogen, with the carbon sequestration, and with really doing things in a better way. And with the benefit of the location, which is so ideally set between the 2 relevant oceans, with access through the Atlantic to the pan-Atlantic supply chains, and on the other side to Apex. And I think something also worth mentioning, the proximity to the Gulf, to Saudi Arabia and to the Gulf states, which are now transitioning from sort of an oil-based economy into industrial economies, is also a great thing. It's, I think, one night of shipping from Dar to Jeddah. So that's another relationship that you should definitely build on and work forward. So, long and short, what I think I'm trying to say here is that I'm optimistic. I actually think that there's a lot of positive, and if we could go like this and be propelled to 2040 or 2045, we would see a young, thriving continent. And over time, I think we were talking mainly, I suppose, about Southern Africa and Western Africa, but also in North Africa and Eastern Africa, there's resources, there's more proximity to the Gulf and more proximity to Europe. So basically on all 4 wind directions in this continent, there's a lot to look forward to.
Thank you. Just wondering if anyone else wants to add anything into that comment. Yeah. Helen, I know we've been waiting for you. How do we unlock Africa's mineral riches and secure financing or investment financing for green metal projects while ensuring that we are internally decarbonizing first?
Thank you, Tolu. I'll just start with a quick opening remarks about Afreximbank. For those of you who don't know, the African Export-Import Bank, we're a 30-year-old development financial institution. Our primary mandate is to promote the enhancement of trade across the continent, but we recognize that in delivering on that mandate, we also need to support trade enabling in infrastructure. At Afreximbank, we believe in the concept of a just transition, but at the same time, we believe that the path towards economic development and industrialization, while at the same time decarbonizing, it's not mutually exclusive. But in achieving that, again, putting into consideration the fact that 600 million people on the continent do not have access to electricity, and Africa only contributes 4% of global emissions. If we are to embark on a decarbonization path, however just, you're going to need revenues, right? And where are those revenues going to come from? And the reality is that even though, and I think it's been said numerous times, that Africa is home to 30% of the minerals needed to decarbonize, the reality is that because we participate at the bottom of the food chain, we literally give away too much. And you need resources, you need revenues to decarbonize. But if you're participating at the bottom of the food chain, that means you're getting less revenues. I was listening to an analogy about bauxite and how When it's processed in its raw form, it's $150 per ton. But when the value is created offshore, it's almost 50-fold. It's like $2,500 per ton. But how can Africa achieve that? And I think this is where the AfCFTA comes into play. And for those of you who don't know, that's the Africa Free Trade Continental Trade Agreement, which essentially aims to reduce and break down trade barriers. And trade barriers range from everything from tariffs to improving transportation bottlenecks, and just even to dwell on the concept of transportation, because a lot of the arguments made against value addition is that it's actually cheaper to transport minerals from Africa to China than it is to transport minerals, for example, from the DRC to somewhere in West Africa. But the AfCFTA seeks to reduce those bottlenecks and bring the capacity to create more localized manufacturing, which improves Africa's position in the entire value chain and creates more revenues, which we will use and we will need to decarbonize. Another thing it's also critical is I would say the advocacy of sustainable mining practices. And I think, at Afreximbank, we are big proponents of promoting sustainable mining practices. In fact, one of the things that we insist on is the provision of an abandonment account, because it's important to restore your surroundings to the state that you met it before the mining activity started. And by putting aside an abandonment account and you start a sinking fund, putting funds aside, it's not only brings confidence to the community, for which you need their support to even continue mining, but it signals your intention that you are interested in sustainable mining. I'll just comment on one final note, which is having consistency in policy framework, regulatory framework. I mean, I had a mining transaction in, I won't mention the country, where in the course of 2 years, there were 3 mining ministers. And each minister obviously had their own agenda, had, their own priorities. And, it just, first of all, diminished confidence in the transaction, diminished confidence in the government's support of the transactions. And, I think we cannot overemphasize the importance of collaboration, not just collaboration from the perspective of regional collaborations, but collaborations between the government and the private sector and development financial institutions such as ourselves. I talked about creating localized manufacturing capacity, and it's probably been announced here, but in 2021, we funded a pre-feasibility study undertaken by Bloomberg, where we sought to establish how viable it is to participate in the value chain for electric vehicles, which is battery precursors. And the results showed that it costs 3 times less to produce that on the continent versus China. So following on that, we have entered into an agreement with Zambia and the DRC, where we're going to be building a special economic zone. And the idea is to create the infrastructure, because I think that's the reoccurring theme and the rhetoric that, well, we're miners, our job is to mine, we're upstream miners, we're not in the business of refineries, we're not in the business of creating infrastructure. So, okay, we said, well, as a development financial institution and bringing solutions to the table, let's create this special economic zone, which provides the basic infrastructure to encourage manufacturing companies to come and set up locally on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaking of governments, Mwelwa, what is the role of government in the energy transition and critical minerals? And how is this supporting or suppressing the move to net zero?
Yeah, policy, legislation, investment. The energy transition, it can't happen without government intervention in securing and regulating critical minerals, as mentioned by Helen as well. In my view, critical minerals are still minerals. They are generally mined and processed the same way, just maybe at smaller quantities. But you can't underestimate the expertise that's required to explore and develop. And so governments, in my view, should always take a clear long-term position outside of election cycles that really or truly reflect their adherence to net zero. Maybe just quickly, so that I don't take long in answering the question, when you speak about policy and legislation, supporting net zero would be things around climate commitment or carbon policies. You've seen many nations adopting the Paris Agreement aligned policies, or maybe up until a few weeks ago when the US announced what they announced. And I know President Trump is watching our panel, so I hope he doesn't tweet anything. And as I mentioned, I think in my earlier question, the critical mineral strategies, which are a lot more prevalent now and being announced by governments. In terms of suppressing net zero, it would be inconsistencies around those policies. Resource nationalization, which is a very topical matter, and we won't get into that, but that too is a suppressant of net zero. And then just briefly about investment in infrastructure and supply chain. Energy infrastructure development, so investment into grids, generation, clean energy, PPPs. That's also something that is a positive support of net zero, and a suppressing net zero of that would be a lack of investment into things like processing and refining. I feel a lot of that slows down your supply chain diversification.
Thank you. I think I'm going to ask Billy, and then if anyone else wants to come in after, how important the role of international involvement is in achieving just transition, and what financing methods can foreign partners provide to de-risk and catalyze investments to unlock value addition.
I think it's important that all players bring something to the table. I think it's important that the funders are able to see value in projects in the local context and to be able to see the returns from that. I think everybody acknowledges that most of these projects would not take off without the collaboration of different players, and we do know. I mean, you've got to go outside here and look at the number of projects that are possible to be done that needs people to come together. So you do need the developers of projects to be able to identify, explore, and find those projects. But at the same time, it's important that the funders come to the party, and also to find that the entrepreneurs, people like ourselves that invest in projects, all collaborate. And I mean, it's a known fact that these projects then become successful in that context. More importantly, obviously, there is a need for government to put the right legislation that incentivizes that type of investment. So all the things that we know in terms of tax breaks, in terms of benefits that these projects need. And that's why the collaboration of government is important. It's also important that the DFIs come to the table, because then they are able to put in the enabling investments that you need, the infrastructure that we've been speaking about. They're able to look at making sure that they enable local investors and local entrepreneurs within where the projects are. So that's also very important. But lastly, for me, making sure that everybody collaborates enables for these projects then to be done. And again, all of these projects need a lot of money for them to happen. So for me, the role of getting everybody together is just beyond. You can't even stress it enough.
I'd also like to ask if Helen has anything, and then Erez, you can speak.
I feel obliged to respond. I think it's the two ways to look at it, financial and non-financial. So just from a non-financial perspective, I think the transfer of knowledge and skill sets is very critical. I mean, we all know that Africa is home to the youngest population. How do we upskill and reskill the population and prepare them for the future? And you're just speaking about the role of DFIs and how they can help local entrepreneurs. A couple of years ago, we set up this EPC contractor initiative because we recognized the deficit in local entrepreneurs participating in the entire value chain, in the whole contract process, and not just specific to mining, but in power and infrastructure. And what we do is that from a facilitation perspective, we help advocate for those local entrepreneurs to actually bid for some of those jobs. We actually also support them with the necessary financial instruments that they need to be competitive to bid for those jobs. A couple of years ago, we also set up a project preparation department, and what it does is that it provides early stage funding because we recognize that on average on the continent, it takes 7 years from when a project is conceived to when you reach financial close. And that's because a lot of the entrepreneurs are not even savvy enough to understand what is required to get your deal to a financial close. And that's not even putting into context the resources needed to get it to that stage. So that's what the Project Preparatory Facility does. It's $3 million. It's a loan. And the idea is that it's deducted as a first-line drawdown item where you reach financial close. And it could be used for a multitude of purposes. It can be used for feasibility studies. It can be used for capacity building. It can even be used to pay advisory fees. And we also provide the risking instruments because we noticed that a lot, the perception of risk on the continent is real. We provide sovereign risk guarantees. We provide insurance instruments to mitigate those risks. There's a whole slew of the risking instruments that we provide. We are also launching a $500 million concessional fund because if we are really going to pursue this path of decarbonization, you can't really do it at commercial loans interest rate. And then this just speaks to the debt sustainability of most of the African sovereigns and the fact that it's almost approaching unsustainable lessons. So the use of blended finance, where you incorporate concessional financing with more commercial debt, is also critical. And I think that's where DFIs like ourselves can play a good role. Thank you.
I'll be quick, but just a few observations in terms of the roles of the government and looking at it from an FID, from a FDI point of view. Zero tolerance to corruption. That's a very strong message that has to be sent loud and clear. And that's and the other thing is stability, continuity, no zigzagging, no erratic type of legislation, ups and downs on state free carried portions and so on. And from that respect, I'm not sure if my home country, the United States, is sending the right message recently, but hopefully from rocking the boat, something good will happen. But that's very, very important, and that's something that's critical, especially when it's it's a relatively new jurisdictions, and you're asking people to sink billions and potentially trillions into the ground in immovables. At the end of the day, is to project this sense of calmness and continuity and stability. That's very, very important. Another thing in that, I think, just as a small observation on midstream conversion, which is obviously very, very important, but it's not so much the way we see it, kind of analyze how the profits are spread all the way along the value chain. If you're in the right point in the cycle, you can make a ton of money in mining. And the branding, the marketing is sort of on the downstream. In the middle, it's blood, sweat, and tears. It's hard work. It's a lot of capex. If you think about it, these are relatively small margins. Industrial companies are traded with relatively small multiples. It's hard work. What's taken away when this happens somewhere else is not necessarily so much about the profits, about the TCRCs or the melting premium or all of that, but it's about creating this whole ecosystem where you have more jobs that require a higher level of education. So it sort of pulls society upwards. It's where it enables potentially the downstream to set shop not too far from you. So suddenly you have the branding and the marketing and the downstream, and when a lot of more people will move into middle class, and given that this is a very young continent, this is going to converge very well. And on the back end, it actually gives the the upstreamers the reason to open shop, because if there's a winery in my district, I can grow some grapes. Someone's going to buy them. I don't necessarily have to send them to China, which may be a little bit more sophisticated and demanding from that perspective. So the midstream is critical because it's a bottleneck that unlocks and enables a lot of things, but it's not necessarily just from the monetary perspective of how much of the value is distributed unfairly within the mine to finished product sort of value chain. It's an engine, it's a catalyst from economic perspective, from a social perspective, and so on. So that's just as an observation on that. It's hard work, capital intense, many times rather pollutive. So there's a reason why, China exported part of the pollution to Sulawesi and so on, where instead of having it in Tianjin like in the good old days. So just that's another thing to sort of take into consideration, and that's where innovation also comes, because when you build up your midstream conversion, there's an opportunity to already do it in a better way than we've been doing it in the West and in Greater China.
Thank you. And with the last minute, I would like to open up the floor to see if there's any questions. Well, thank you everyone for the session today. I think it was quite insightful. I think the main thing that we take out of this is that this is just a very small conversation in how large this topic is. And I think ultimately what I got from what our panelists have said today is that it's collaboration. It really is every single person, and through the whole process, collaborating and taking responsibility for all the aspects that will allow us to get to net zero. So thank you, everyone, and have a good day.